Welcome back to the program. James Morrow here, filling in for Paul Murray. You're watching Paul Murray Live, and it is my very great privilege to bring to you my next guest, former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. Now, we're going to have a bit of a free-ranging discussion about the voice and energy and all that sort of stuff. But, John, I want to start by asking you, just had a real panel of city slickers on, myself, Senator Hughes, and Joe Hildebrand. But you're from the bush. You live in the bush. This voice debate, what is happening in rural Australia with this?
My family have been interacting with Aboriginal people since the 1820s. I went to school with Aboriginal people. I represented an electorate with the fifth highest proportion, I think, of Aboriginals in Australia, around 11 or 12% by their calculations. And I actually do care. I feel you've got to say that. I actually really care about this, and nothing makes me feel more emotional than seeing young Indigenous kids' lives being thrown up against the wall. And I saw an awful lot of it. I think what's happening now is that I'm really surprised at the level of anger that's building amongst a lot of country people. And I think it's partly because they feel they've been duped. I think, like the rest of Australia, they wanted to support recognition. I wanted to support recognition. But recognition has now had tacked onto it the voice. They won't tell us what the voice is. They can't tell us how it's going to make a difference. Country people are cynical because we've seen a lot of these voices before and they haven't worked. You could argue they could make them worse. Peter Sutton argues that progressive politics have made the problem worse in remote communities, and he's probably Australia's leading Indigenous anthropologist. And it's obvious now that the voice is really part of a separatist movement. This was meant to bring us together. It's divided us now. The long-term game, we have to be suspicious now, because of the games of deception, the lack of answers, is about separatism. It's co-sovereignty. How does that work? And people are starting, I've noticed the baseball bats are starting to come out. The Prime Minister should really order to defer this and go to a constitutional convention and get us talking to one another, so that we can come up with something we can agree on.
But this whole idea of, this Uluru Statement, this one piece of paper, and we're endorsing that. I mean, even that Uluru Statement has treaty and makarata or truth-telling or whatever you call it.
Sovereignty never lost. That's the language of separatism.
And
so we're told this is meant to draw us together. It's not. It's dividing us. And the Uluru Statement, it's more fist than kiss.
Well, and I want to ask you about what former Prime Minister Tony Abbott said the other night. He was talking about all of these welcomes to country, and this picks up on something that I've noticed, both in the tone and tenor of some of these ceremonies, but also the way, people speak about them when the subject comes up. People feel, I think, that there is an effort by an activist class on the left, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, to essentially delegitimize post-settlement Australia, or at least post-settlement to Whitlam Australia, and say everything that happened there was terrible and we need to tear down this structure of modern Australia, which is quite prosperous and democratic and tolerant as these things go.
Well, I met a very fine Indigenous man the other day out on my own farm, and he just said, terrible things have happened, but actually I have a degree, my family have a degree, I have a small business. I'm against the voice. This is an Indigenous man. Because I enjoy my life as an Australian and I don't want to be singled out. And I think you're right. There is this determined attempt right across particularly the Anglosphere, but in the West generally, as Douglas Murray calls it, the war on the West, from within, to demonise our past, not to recognise the achievements, to actually deny our kids the opportunity to know both the good things and the bad, because true history will record both. So you can learn from the mistakes, but the impression being created in our young people is that they are the inheritors of such a nightmarish culture it shouldn't be defended.
Well, and I mean, isn't this, I guess you can trace it back to Marx and Marcuse and other thinkers on this, but it's this negation of any power structure. So the left looks at a power structure, modern Australia, and has to figure out a way to negate it, essentially. Isn't that what we're seeing here. And the Voice and Indigenous Affairs is the counterbalance that they use to do that.
Well, in the great sweep of things, yes, of course, you've had since the 1920s and the Frankfurt School and all the rest of it. Why are other Western countries not seeing the uprising of the working classes in Russia? It was never an uprising of the working classes anyway.
No.
But that was the Marxist model. The working classes should rise up. They seem to be they've been opiated. So we've got to attack the institutions that are keeping them in their place. You've had the march through the left through the institutions. It has been staggeringly successful. So, call it neo-Marxism, call it cultural Marxism, call it, identity politics, call it, if you like, critical theory, call it wokery, call it, frankly, deception. The common thing, in the case of the Voice, but the thing that's common here is that this is about power.
Yeah.
It's not about principle. And that's the ugly thing. And the fact that the Voice is to be put into the Constitution forever, if the objective was to close the gap, which we all want to see happen, why would you not assume that this thing should sunset when the gap's been closed and we've all come together as one? You have to say to yourself, activists will use this to keep us divided.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, we always hear about reconciliation. This is a beautiful word. It's a wonderful idea. But the idea implies that there is some point where we are reconciled, and it seems to me that like Marx's state, it would someday fade off into the sunset. You'd never see it. But this seems to me like it would employ an awful lot of people who have a vested interest in keeping problems existing, so they've got something to solve. It's like a fire department without fires.
Look, from a rural point of view, farmers have not missed what happened in Western Australia. The activists climbed on board. And this is why I don't believe the Voice will work in the end. I believe that mainstream, decent Indigenous Australians will find that activists grab this and create a climate of distrust and of division and of dislike, if you like, particularly in regional areas and in the remote areas, which will come against Aboriginal people. I genuinely believe that that is what it will happen if we go down this road. The Voice, the whole Makarata, which basically means payback.
Yes, correct.
That's what it really means.
We spoke about this last night on the show.
Yeah. I mean, the people who know what it means. It's not a particularly friendly word. It doesn't accord with our idea of forgiveness, making up, reconciliation, moving on together.
Yeah, it's not having a beer after the game.
So that's right. And and treaties. I mean, how do you do a treaty with yourself? And how do you negotiate a treaty? I mean, this is the problem the states are finding, isn't it? There were 600 nations. Aboriginality is a race, not a nation. And that's not a critical thing to say. I mean, the Aboriginal people, and many of the ones that I've met, they're very proud of their own small local nation. But they're very widespread. Look at a map of Australia.
John Anderson, before I let you go, I want to ask you about something else happening in the bush, and this is the push for net zero and the effect that it's having in rural communities. I'm hearing complaints all over the shop about the impact, power prices, and, of course, transmission lines and everything else. Tell me, from your perspective, what are you seeing? What are people talking about this push to net zero that the government is headlong on?
Well, just as it has in the Netherlands and, of course, in Sri Lanka and in other parts of the world, it'll become a very hot issue indeed if you start interfering with farmers' ability to produce food and fibre directly. And that looks like it's where it's heading. I mean, we've had Lean all telling us that we're going to cut our cattle numbers in half by 2030. Can I make this point?
Please.
Emissions and climate change are painted as great moral choices. Feeding people is a great moral choice as well. And we have managed, the world's farmers are now feeding 10 billion people every year. Well, there aren't 10 billion people. The only reason anybody goes hungry is corruption, broken infrastructure, and we overeat in the West a bit. We do waste a bit. But that's an incredible achievement, and it's done on the back of affordable energy and fertiliser. Now, if we're going to blow that out of the water, I'm not with you. I'm sorry, and I think farmers will rightly say, this is enough, stop it.
Former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson, thank you so much for joining me tonight.